Welcome, everyone. If you're a focused practitioner looking to master financial reporting, you are absolutely in the right place. Today, we're taking a dense compliance standard, IAS 23 borrowing costs, and translating it into a highly structured, actionable explainer. We aren't just going to read rules to you, we're building a practitioner's playbook. By the time we wrap up, you'll know exactly when you need to capitalize borrowing costs onto your balance sheet and when you've got to expense them immediately.
All right, let's take a quick look at the roadmap for today. We'll be hitting the scope and core principle, identifying qualifying assets, the capitalization timeline, measurement rules, exceptions, and finally, disclosures. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. Scope and Core Principle. We need to figure out exactly when IAS 23 actually applies to your work. The core objective here is really straightforward. If you incur borrowing costs directly attributable to the acquisition or construction of a major asset, well, then those costs are capitalized. They join the asset right on the balance sheet. But if they're just general borrowing costs not tied directly to getting a qualifying asset ready, then they're recognized as an immediate expense in the period incurred. It's really all about matching the true costs of financing a major project directly to the asset itself. Now, the boundaries here are strictly defined. What's explicitly in scope? Actual interest calculated using the effective interest method, your IFRS 16 lease liabilities, and related foreign exchange differences. But you need to watch out for the strict carve-outs, except when dealing with the actual or imputed cost of equity, except when you have biological assets measured at fair value under IAS 41, and except when you are dealing with mass-produced inventory manufactured on a repetitive basis. All of those bypass this standard entirely. Moving on to Section 2, Identifying Qualifying Assets. What exactly counts as a substantial period? Everything really hinges on this specific term of art, the qualifying asset. That is, an asset that necessarily takes a substantial period of time to get ready for its intended use or sale. That substantial period is your central gateway. If you buy a delivery truck and just drive it off the lot today, that's not a qualifying asset. It literally has to be something that takes significant time to build or prepare. We're talking about the massive undertakings here. Manufacturing plants, power generation facilities, major intangible assets, investment properties, and bearer plants, meaning living plants used to supply agricultural produce, like a commercial vineyard that takes years to mature. Notice what's explicitly excluded, though. Financial assets or anything ready right out of the box, like a fully functioning server rack for your IT department.
All right, Section 3, the capitalization timeline. This covers your commencement, suspension, and cessation rules.
You only start the clock when you hit specific triggers. Recognize when all of the following criteria are met. 1, if you incur expenditures for the asset. 2, if you incur borrowing costs. And 3, if you undertake necessary preparation activities. Then, and only then, do you commence capitalization. All 3 of these have to be happening simultaneously to start the clock. The life cycle itself is pretty logical. You commence on day 1 when those exact conditions we just talked about are met. Down the line, say around month 6, you might hit a period where you must suspend capitalization if active development of the asset pauses. And finally, you hit cessation, maybe in year 2, when substantially all physical activities to prepare the asset are complete. But you've got to watch out for this conditional override regarding suspension. Unless the delay is a necessary part of the process, you do not suspend capitalization. Think about building a bridge. If high water levels are totally normal for that region, you keep capitalizing. Same goes if you're carrying out substantial technical or administrative work behind the scenes, even if the physical construction looks like it's completely stopped. Now for cessation. Here's a super common application error. Practitioners often keep capitalizing during minor cosmetic tweaks. The mistake is dragging the timeline out, but the correct treatment is that once the physical heavy lifting is done, capitalization must cease. Routine admin or minor decor modifications do not extend your timeline. Also, if you complete a project in independent usable parts, like a massive business park where one building is totally finished and ready to lease, then you cease capitalizing borrowing costs for that specific building, even while the rest of the park is still under construction. Let's get into Section 4, Measurement, Specific versus General. How do we actually calculate the capitalizable amount? This IF then where framework is basically your ultimate measurement playbook. If you borrowed funds specifically for this asset, then you capitalize actual costs less any temporary investment income. Where does it go? Straight to the statement of financial position, capitalizing the asset. Now, if you use general corporate debt, then you apply a weighted average capitalization rate to the expenditures. Where? Again, capitalized to the statement of financial position. For example, if you issue a corporate bond and use a chunk to build a factory, you use that average rate. But if your total capitalized cost pushes the asset above its recoverable amount, then you have to write down the carrying amount. Where does that hit? That's expensed directly to the P&L.
It's absolutely crucial to remember that you always have a hard ceiling. No matter what number your weighted average formula spits out from your general borrowing pool, you can never, ever capitalize more total interest than you actually incurred during that period. Think of it like a credit card limit. You can't magically create interest income out of thin air through the capitalization process. Which brings us to Section 5, Exceptions, Judgments, and Interactions. Let's navigate some of these gray areas.
You really need to be aware of the estimation uncertainty here. Tracing funds introduces massive variability. If you operate a complex, multinational group with centrally coordinated financing, floating exchange rates, and varying debt instruments, figuring out exactly what loans could have been avoided if you hadn't built the asset is incredibly difficult. This demands heavy professional judgment to determine the directly attributable borrowing costs.
And IAS 23 doesn't operate in a vacuum. It leans heavily on other frameworks for base inputs. It defers to IFRS 9 financial instruments for calculating the effective interest you capitalize. It incorporates lease interest from IFRS 16. If you're operating in a hyperinflationary economy, IAS 29 requires you to deduct the portion of borrowing costs that merely compensates for inflation. And it works alongside IAS 20, accounting for government grants, meaning you actually have to reduce the asset's expenditures by any progress grants before applying your capitalization rate.
Here is a massive red flag for practitioners and a strict prohibition. Per IFRIC 1, as you unwind the discount on a decommissioning or restoration liability over time, that unwinding is treated as a finance cost. However, the rule is crystal clear. This specific finance cost shall not be capitalized under IAS 23. It bypasses capitalization completely and goes straight to your expense line in the P&L. All right, Section 6, Required Disclosures. Let's look at the final reporting. When it comes to required disclosures in your notes, it's actually incredibly concise. There are no qualitative narratives required here. You just need two precise quantitative data points. First, the total exact monetary amount of borrowing costs you capitalized during the period. And second, the specific capitalization rate you used to determine that eligible amount from your general borrowings. That's the whole shebang for disclosures. I'll leave you with this final application scenario to ponder. We talked about a business park where you can stop capitalizing as each building finishes. But what if you're building a multi-stage industrial plant, like a sequential steel mill, where the furnace, the rolling lines, and the cooling areas absolutely must be completed before a single piece of steel can be produced? Well, in this case, because no single part can be used independently, the standard forces you to keep capitalizing borrowing costs across the entire project until that very last component is ready to roll. Thanks for joining this explainer on IAS 23. Keep this playbook handy and you'll navigate these borrowing costs with absolute confidence.